and Deb will be speaking. Deb and the folks will be speaking from 1 to 2 about advancing family and community well-being, healing-centered engagement. And I know that Deb is going to dedicate a little bit of her time to discussing CarePath, which is an incredibly innovative model. If you've not heard about CarePath before, you're really in for a really interesting discussion, because it really, and it's work that Deb has really created, the whole idea of whole health. You know, we talked about whole health parity when John and the folks were presenting about colleges. This is a whole health recovery, and it's really, you know, I think it's an incredible, you know, innovative program, and I know we'll talk about it in the context of, you know, of the healing discussion. So looking forward to it, looking forward to the other speakers. And then after that, we don't take a break. We go right to 2 o'clock, where we'll talk about 988 implementation. But right now, I'm just going to hand it over to Deb. Deb, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Glenn. Thank you. Again, my name is Deborah Faust. I am the Director of Family Engagement and Support at the Mental Health Association in New York State, and I'm going to moderate this conversation. But before I do, introduce these passionate advocates, these community advocates, I'd like to begin by defining healing-centered engagement for those listeners that may be unfamiliar with the term. Healing-centered engagement is the result of Dr. Sean Ginwright's work that suggests that collective harm requires a different approach. Healing-centered engagement addresses the collective experience of traumatic stress and loss in our families, our schools, and our communities. And it offers insights into the limits of only treating symptoms rather than focusing on the social determinants of health in which people are born, grow, live, work, and ultimately age. And for some people, the term trauma-informed care doesn't encompass the totality of their experience. Black, Indigenous people of color need validation that their trauma is a result of inequality of conditions, and their legacy is one of survival and determination. So it's vital that they're offered openings for self-empowerment. In healing-centered engagement, culture serves as the anchor and connection to race and ethnic identities, and it's historically grounded. It goes beyond just viewing healing through the lens of a clinical approach and supports individuals and communities to be agents in restoring their own healing and well-being and bring their personal to the political. Our sense of well-being is linked to our health, to the health and growth of our communities, our immediate environment, and our planet. And community well-being is dependent upon the health and well-being of its members. It's a symbiotic relationship. And this conversation today will shed light on how advocates can frame initiatives that will offer a holistic approach in advancing community and family health equity. So now I'd like to introduce our panelist. Dennis Mosley works out of the Albany Public Defender's Office as a human service coordinator, and he's a grassroots community advocate with a varied career working in specifically distressed communities in the areas of criminal justice, homelessness, and inner city community development. Mr. Mosley's studies in sociology have led him to be observant of the demographics and research in the decline of health and the decline of the health of his own community. He's worked the streets going door to door in political campaigning, highlighting the enormous healthcare disparities in the capital region. And Dennis is currently working together with the African American Clergy for Empowerment in an effort to offer historical circles to be at the forefront of healing and change. Thank you, Dennis, for being with us today. And then, Julika von Stackelberg, and I hope I got it right, is a credentialed parenting educator and certified parenting coach who focuses on building resilient communities as the family and community resilient educator at Cornell Cooperative Extension of Orange County. And Julika chairs the Orange County Parenting Coalition and spearheads the Orange County Resilience Project. She teaches on various topics related to raising and teaching children, working with families, and building communities of belonging. Thank you, Julika. And Deborah Williams. She is a community connector who has a long reach in her community. Deborah brings over 30 years of diverse skill and expertise to her body of work. Her work with individuals and organizations has been an example of healing-centered engagement. She works with organizations, policymakers, consumers to develop programs, policies, and secure support for transforming organizations and communities. Deborah helps individuals achieve their employment goals through plans to achieve self-support and has served as a consultant for the New York State Department of Ed in adult career and continuing education services. Her experience in small business development, organizational change, multicultural organizational development has provided opportunities for restoring a sense of well-being to people of all identities while eliminating structural oppression. Thank you so much, Deborah. I am grateful to be a part of this conversation today. And once again, thank you, panelists. Some boundaries today include keeping your responses to each question under 5 minutes to ensure that all perspectives are heard throughout the conversation, and we'll have time for questions. So our focus today is on how we can advance family and community well-being. And throughout our programming at MHANYS, we associate the 8 dimensions of wellness for supporting family and community well-being. And the 8 dimensions include the physical dimension of our health, social, emotional, environmental, occupational, intellectual, financial, and spiritual. The 8 dimensions also highlight disparities. And that brings me to my first question for you, Dennis. Your work in the community has responded to the collective trauma resulting from disparities. So how do specific dimensions of health and wellness influence disparities? And can you give us an example? Also, why is it important to examine all the dimensions of a family's health and well-being as a community advocate?
Let's start with
I know that's long-winded.
A lot there. It's a lot there. So start the word holism, being the whole human being, the whole community, and everything connects back to that as the spokes in a wheel back to the center, and the center being whole. So you can't do one thing without the other. They all affect and intersect upon each other. So it's important to look at the whole human being, and the whole human being in terms of their family, the whole human being in terms of their community. It's important to see all of that in one. I think it's important.
Can I ask you to explain, how do those specific dimensions that I just listed, right? All of those 8 dimensions impact a family's health and ultimately the community's well-being as well. So how do those specific dimensions of health influence disparities and in everyday life, right?
Well, a person becomes fragmented. One, communities are fragmented in the society that promotes disparate assistance. Then the individuals gets broken apart. To make them whole would be to be able to have all these things going on in themselves and in their communities. So to describe any one particular thing and how that is affects healthcare disparities, I'm not really sure. I've been talking about healthcare disparities a great deal in the last 10 years or so, and particularly in the last 6, since the Brandeis study came out. And the Brandeis study came out Brandeis, Ohio State study came out in 2015, and it named Albany as the worst place to raise a Black child in the nation out of 100 metropolitan areas. Wow. And so that kind of motivated me in a way that, and other numbers start coming out, like in the South End of Albany, it has 2 census tracts of the worst, the tops in incarceration rate than anywhere else in the state. And you think, what about the Bronx or somewhere else? We're talking about per capita, the worst in the state. Most segregated neighborhoods, some of the worst in the state. Infant mortality, #1 in the country.
Wow.
And
Wow.
I say these kind of facts over and over again, and it blows people away. But I mean, I've been living with this and talking about this. It's almost that, do we see what this is? There's a problem. There's a historical problem here. There's a political problem here. People being divided up, and not coming together around their own issues. So the idea of restorative practice, which I'm a practitioner and a trainer, brings together the whole human being to the situation, and people who have been harmed and people who have harmed in the community. Now, I think that's part of the solution, try to do that in the community and from the grassroots. And the other piece of that being kind of a cultural competence. That's what there's the old word now, the cultural humility, I think people are calling it now. But that whole idea of the people who have been harmed, and I'm thinking those people are descendants of African enslaved in the United States. That group of people, not to forget, because they get colored over, because they're looking at other people, Hispanics or other people from Africa, come in. It's a different kind of trauma. It's a different kind of trauma that exists in Albany that didn't exist anywhere else in the country. Do we have those people doing work in the front lines of helping each other? No, we don't. We've got other people working for them as proxies of them. So we end up being in a situation where we have the worst healthcare disparities in the country, in this region, in this capital region. Wow. I say it over and over, and it doesn't hit anybody. Oh, man, what are we going to do about it?
Well, those 8 dimensions that I mentioned that I read off earlier, occupational, right? Environmental, physical, social, emotional, financial, we need to understand how to define whole family and community health and well-being. And so that people will be aware of where those gaps are and to recognize them in their community. So thank you for that information. And I'm going to get back to you, Dennis, in a couple of minutes, but I'd like to ask you, Yulika, supporting healthy communities involves initiatives that focus on prevention instead of always responding to trauma. So how did you arrive at recognizing healing-centered engagement as a trauma-informed response for supporting resilient families and communities?
Yeah, thank you so much. That's a really good question. And maybe I'm just going to start with a quick personal story in that to sort of illustrate where really this comes from. So I have 3 children, and when my youngest was, just about 2, and I found myself saying all kinds of things that I promised I would never say to my children. And I was wondering where that was coming from, and really recognizing that the limitations that I had, I started looking for parenting tools and discovered there was, whole libraries full of books on parenting, which I somehow had no idea about. And long story short, this is kind of where my journey as a parenting educator then really originated and continued to evolve. And later, when I learned about adverse childhood experiences, I had a kind of a similar response, and really recognized that. So if we have, if we're parenting with ACEs, and what does that mean for our children? And so we began in Orange County through the Orange County Parenting Coalition, screening the film Resilience, which immediately is like a wonderful little match, because you can go around, screen the film, and you're lighting little fires of discussions that are very passionate about what we can do to address this. And so we delved into this whole subject on resilience and being trauma informed. And I think in the process of, familiarizing and basically peeling away the layers. So what does it mean when you are trauma informed or you're trauma responsive? You're recognizing the impact of trauma on all of us. Then you are recognizing, okay, so we have to focus on what are the aspects that are strong with us? Where, does resilience come in? How does that play? And then you somehow get to this understanding, okay, so that means that if we need to focus on trauma-informed and resilience-building communities, then oh my God, we have to look at our entire environment and where all of the harm comes from and where we can create opportunities to prevent this. And then we recognize so much has happened in the long away history and not so long away history that continues to impact all of us, that we cannot just, poof, make it go away because we explain it, but we really need to engage in healing processes so that we can acknowledge this what happened, acknowledge the harm that was caused, and then also inform our approaches that then really prevent any reharming or re-wounding, so to speak, as well as new wounds that can be caused. And then looking at, what does an environment look like that is healing centered or healing that engages in the healing process. So that's kind of where we came from. And we've developed a coalition in Orange County where I'm at. That's called the Orange County Resilience Project, which is a collaborative or between different community organizations, including members of the community. So really trying to be as grassroots as possible to basically raise awareness about this entire process, that I just described in a minute or two, and to so that we can really see, the world through a broader lens that also includes a lot of reflection where, which ultimately leads to transformation inside of us so we can transform through the work that we're doing. And this is a long-term project. There's a lot of work that we have to do, but I really see the potential there for, the healing-centered engagement as an approach or framework that can create the kinds of environments that, hopefully really address the disparities that Dennis just described. I mean, yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much. What I love about the concept with healing-centered engagement is it promotes us looking deeply into our environments, where we were born. I'm a person that grew up with extreme poverty, and I used to always say, it's not that easy, to just pull yourself up by the bootstraps, because poverty brings a lot of trauma with it. But what I like about healing-centered engagement is that you're not just looking and thinking of the shame of trauma in your life. You're looking at the broader picture, which brings about empowerment. And it brings about, this opportunity for a real holistic healing journey, and not have people just think as individuals that it's about something they did. For Black, Indigenous people of color, they're agents in their own change and their own healing. And that's the empowerment piece that so many people who cling to some of the survival language, miss out on, in my opinion, because you really do need to look at, the conditions that brought you to where you were at. And that brings that empowering piece. And you get to give that back. You get to give that back to the community. So I loved when I started reading about healing-centered engagement. It really transformed the way I felt about trauma in my own life, and certainly the way I feel about it in other communities. So I'd like to move on now to Deborah. This question, Deborah, is for you. We know about the benefits of trauma responses for individuals, but what are the benefits for organizations to use healing-centered engagement as a trauma-informed approach for addressing economic self-sufficiency, multiculturalism, community development, et cetera, et cetera? So what are your thoughts on that?
A lot of thoughts. First of all, kind of a number of things that I heard. Just now you were speaking about survival language. And I was thinking before you talked about the symbiotic relationship of a lot of these issues. And I sit and think about and talk about and work with people all the time and talk about our ways of knowing as people and our ways of healing. I've done a lot of, and still do, some like anti-oppression training, whether people call it diversity training, which is a title I personally hate, but I always hated it. I don't really care what banner and what people call it. I don't invest my time in that after doing this so many years. I still do the same thing in the training. So I let people fight over what they call it. I go in and do the same things. But whatever training I do with people, there's a part of the process. And I've had groups fight with me when they see something like this on the agenda. But I say, I'm the expert. You hired me to come in and do it. I know what I'm doing. Where I have people share about their own personal cultures. There's a reason I do that. It's not to have the diversity luncheon. I'm way beyond that. I stopped that when I was in grade school. But it's because we all have different ways of knowing that come out of our culture. Whether you lived with that, whether you got that from your grandmother, whether you learned that as an adult or learned that from books, because everybody is not fortunate enough to have learned that in their household for many different reasons. You may not have been raised in a household that is the culture that you come from, for many different reasons. Or maybe you weren't raised around people that understood the culture either. Maybe you're all learning together as you're all adults, for many different reasons. But there still are these cultural ways of knowing. And those will also be a part of your cultural ways of healing that we can all benefit from. So these things are entrenched in the threads of the quilt of our institutions and of our society. And we don't really understand that. That's some of the historical information that we don't have many times. And we don't understand how this can be utilized in our organizations. That's some of the many ways it can help our institutions. Some of the problems that it shows. And I talk to people all the time about dealing with the underlying disease in your organizations, in our systems. Because if you deal with the underlying diseases, you don't have the symptoms. I say it's just like if you have the flu. You can work on the stuffy nose and the chills and the body aches, but if you get rid of the flu, you don't have any of that stuff, And so I'd much rather get rid of the flu than try to handle the symptoms. I mean, it's really, it's really good to get rid of the symptoms, but all the flu, I have none of those problems. And so some of the problems, not having diverse funding as an experienced fundraiser. When you're going to the same funders, and I'm hearing this all the time because who's not looking for money. And so I hear people saying, Deborah, we can't get money right now. There's a couple of funding sources out there. One's a national funding source and one's a regional funding source. And you wouldn't believe how many people are calling me, how many text messages, just as I was about to sign on and I rebooted my computer to sign on here. I had people say, I have to talk to you about this funding source. But you know how many people are calling me about this one funding source? Because you don't have relationships with Black women led not-for-profits. Because I sit on a national board of directors and they know me and they know what I do. Now you want to go and talk to me now? I have all these text messages with that one thing. The problem isn't you can't go after this funding. The problem is you don't have relationships with not-for-profits led by Black women. That's your real problem. And so you get it now. And so that is a presenting issue. Deborah, we looked around our board meeting and guess who we don't have on our board? No, you didn't look around. Let's tell the real story. You didn't look around. A funder, a potential joint venture partner looked around and told you, you need to have these people on your board. I keep telling you need to have these people on your board. You didn't just look around, because I guarantee every board meeting you had, you looked around and saw who was in that room or who was not in that room. Deborah, we serve 52% females and we only have one female. And before she was here, we had two females and one didn't show up in the meetings. You didn't just realize you didn't have females here. You only had a women's bathroom and half the stalls in there did not work and the other half didn't have doors on them. You knew you had an issue. So this is not new information. And you just didn't decide to do anything about it until the symptoms showed up. And the symptom also hurt enough that you're now going to do something about it, because that symptom did not just show up. It just started hurting you enough that you're going to do something about it. We don't have people with disabilities. That was not an issue for you before. No, it was an issue. It just didn't hurt you enough. And so there are many reasons why you need to deal with these symptoms. And as the times begin to show you that it becomes the thing that you need to do, a funder says it to you, you don't get certified for a program. I have two programs. One's in New York State, one's in another state that I have a number of clients, and they're saying, oh, we offer programs to young people, and they're saying that we have to be accessible. And those 2 accessible parking spaces that we marked out there, one that's not even really accessible, is not enough. We have to really be accessible. I said, really? Says the lady who was in a wheelchair for almost 11 years. You know, who you talking to? And so you really have to do this now. Well, let's do this. You can really do it now. So those are, and I tell people, there are really like 5 or 6 reasons why people call me to really do this. It's not, you know, Deborah, my heart is telling me we really need to do this. One organization had a sponsor, and a major sponsor was an insurance company. It's one in this region. And their sponsor had a son who was diagnosed with autism, and he was not having it. So they had to change up or lose a major sponsor. And when they called me, I said, good, because I am who I am. And so there are major benefits to the organization doing this. And I said, you will have a richer organization. You will do your work better. You will not have to scurry around for the right staff people. You will have better relationships with your staff people. You will have a volunteer pool. Week before last, I helped one of my clients get a consulting contract to do minority outreach. I said, oh my God, this just took me back 23 years. And I literally went to some things I did 23 years ago. The fact that they called it minority outreach and some of the things they wanted them to do. I said, do tell them that if they do this, they may get sued. Some of the things that they put in the scope of work, they actually want someone to do. And tell them that I work with domestic violence programs. You know, this is back in the day when I was a legal advocate and outreach coordinator for a local domestic violence program. And they didn't say these things this way. So they should not say that anymore to anybody and never email it to anywhere. You know, this is way, you know, and I'm so glad they were in another state, but I was sad that anybody was saying that anymore. And so there are more benefits than I could possibly name, but there's every reason to do this. But the first reason is that it makes you better at what you do. And that should be the first reason, is it makes your vision real and living. You do everything you do better. If you're talking about healing-centered engagement, this is what it really is. So either you're doing it or you're not. And if you're not making your organization truly multicultural, and I use the term multicultural because it brings in the truth of the intersectionality around race, around gender, around sexual identity, around religion, around disability. It brings in all of that. It takes it out of the individual interactions, the institutional structure, into the structure of the industry, because that is the way it needs to change. And when you change it at that level, there is no real risk. It's just the risk of you actually being real with what you say you're doing anyway.
No, thank you, Deborah. That, you know, what I love about healing-centered engagement is it's looking at where a person lives, where a person works, where they were born, where they're going to age, where they're going to raise their family. It's a real holistic view of health and wellness.
Exactly.
So thank you for the work that you do. You know, I want to ask this next question to Dennis, because you mentioned restorative practices earlier, Dennis. And for listeners wondering what that might mean, restorative practices is a social science that studies how to improve and repair relationships between people and communities. And I know, Dennis, that you're actively involved in offering restorative practices to improve relationships. And this is the part I really want you to flesh out for us. By addressing the harm done and seeking out solutions by the most affected by that harm. So how does this approach support a trauma-sensitive response in supporting family and community health?
Yes, John Kutro and I brought restorative practice to Albany County some 20-something years ago. And we trained police officers and district attorney's office and community members. And I've seen it be diluted, taken away from its origins in the Maori tribe in Africa, the way people dealt with the wrongdoing. And instead of kicking people out of the community, they kept them in community as long as they could admit that they had done something wrong or against the tribe's norms. They could stay in community, which they wanted to. And they would just, every person in that circle around that person would say what happened to them, how they were affected by the wrongdoing. I don't like calling social sciences. I try to get away from the whole dynamic of the study and APA dynamics of looking at something from that kind of, I guess I say, Eurocentric lens. And I think I see it much more organic than that. In fact, I just finished a course with the grad school, the International School of Restorative Practice, and that was one of my battles, dealing with that kind of work towards footnotes and that kind of thing. Though they're important in some dimension to transfer information, they also came out with recently at the APA how they were racist, the history of racism. That came out at the same time I was finished my paper. But I see it as looking at the whole human being, the whole community, and not as we do in the criminal justice system, which I work in now with the public defender's office, is separating a person from the community. So it comes the state versus the person. And in restorative practice, everything remains in the circle. Everything remains in community. And it's a way to people to express how they feel, the affect, how they feel about what's going on with them. And also people who have been hurt by that person, the effect, how that thing has affected them, and to come through that piece together. It's a great process.
Powerful.
It's a powerful process, exactly. I remember doing a circle in the Friends Meeting House over on Washington Avenue here. And when John worked there, he still actually works there still now, taking care of the building, he and his wife. But we started doing circles in that building. And I remember having a family, two Black families, different sides of the track in a sense. And that's how kind of my relationship, my own life. One more upperly mobile class, and other folks were living more poverty line, and their resentments for each other in terms of class. And I loved it because it experiences I've experienced in my own life. My parents were down south, kind of agrarian, coming north through the migration. And they grew up in a block where we had, now is former governor of New York State and Hempstead. And other people, doctors and lawyers on my block, and the dean of the community college down the street. And my father was very insecure about that situation. And I became very anxiety filled around that situation, trying to be a star for my father and trying to represent. So in this restorative circle, we have these two groups that were so close to me in my gut, to experience them in pre-conference, let them know what goes on in a conference, and then in the circle. I can tell you by people that express their emotions, their heart-fought emotions, from the pre-conference to the circle. At the end of this conference, I was crying. And I cry now thinking about how beautiful this thing is, to bring together people who you may think are very diverse and separate, but when you can talk about what's going on with you and how something's affected you, it changes the whole dynamic. And that's what I see, being able to bring that to the community. Now that process I want to get back to on a real level. That's why I kind of have it when the APA and studying it is a different kind of thing, because it's almost like a dance. It's almost like it's from the ground, it's from my heart, it's how I breathe. It's not so much someone else can study it if they like, but that's not really where I want to go. I want to be able to be in that and create that space for people to do that. And in Albany County particularly, it's gotten taken over by the only one that's been promoting, which is a good thing. Is promoting is the district attorney's office, but they've also taken it and kind of diluted it from that piece that I'm talking about. They have proxies for people. You can't have proxies. You got to have people who are being affected, not people standing in for them. Talk about that piece, and that's holism, and that's what I want to see happen. That's what I want to move towards making happen.
Wow. Well, thank you, Dennis. I mean, if we really need that perspective more than ever now. I mean, the one thing that I really benefited from during this COVID experience, this pandemic, is the connection, as global citizens, that no matter who you are, loss hurts, and pain is and sorrow are part of all of our lives. And these restorative practices are now even being used in schools and with young people, which is really exciting because the bedrock of trauma-sensitive responses is rooted in relationship. It's all about the relationship. And so I love restorative practices. I think it's a wonderful tool for healing. So thank you for the work that you do on that, Dennis. Very much appreciated.
I have to say, I mean, I've been around lots of going to schools. That's one thing. And that's anywhere it goes is a good thing. But it tends to get away from community. It tends to get away from top down.
Oh, yes.
Down.
Yes,
and so that's the danger of diluting the force of what it really is. It needs to be in the community. Not only just when kids go to school, that the teachers, in terms of having destructive classrooms, learn something new tool for a destructive classroom, but it needs to be in the community and not to be whitewashed in a way, taken away from its original roots. And that's what happens. And I'm scared of that happening again in another area in terms of trauma-informed care. Now it's being taught or trying to be placed in institutions to top down. I don't think it works that way. I think you can't stop doing this top down. It's got to come from community, and it's got to be in the community instead of coming top down at people. Otherwise, it destroys the whole gut of what it is, the spiritual dimension of what it is. So I'm concerned about that. And so I think that solution one is to look at peers, people who are being affected by the issue, the ones doing the training, are doing the groups. You know, more peers are the lifeblood of changing this dynamic top down.
Well, look at what the peers have done to support recovery. I mean, they've radicalized recovery,
right?
You know, in behavioral health care. So yes, you know, lived experience is powerful on all levels. Right. It's funny, this morning, you know, I coordinated a presentation from a fellow from an indigenous tribe, the HaShoshanes, up in the border of Canada and the United States. And when I asked him for a bio, you know, this is my, you know, training coming out, he said, "Oh, I'm a man who helps other men." And I'm like, "That's it?" You know, he goes, "Yeah." He says, "I don't get into all that other stuff, you know, because he leads men's groups and he helps men that have been perpetrators in one form or another. And so he just is a man who helps other men." And then, you know, in his opening presentation, the other thing that really, you know, spoke to me is he said, "You know, I'm building a better relationship with my tongue." And I said to myself, I could sure use that, you know, but, you know, and what he meant by that is he said, in my old life, I used to use improper words, you know, swear words, basically. He said, and I'm building a better relationship with my tongue, you know, and I just thought, wow, that is just, that concept alone is a mindful practice in itself, you know. But yeah, I mean, you know, getting things diluted, or like you said, you know, when it doesn't come from lived experience, it loses so much of its value. So that's what I also see in the restorative practices, because, you know, I've been introduced to that myself, you know, about 20 years ago as well. And I just loved it, absolutely loved it. So now moving on, I'm going to ask you, Yulika, you know, a lot of people feel that they, you know, need to be trauma specialist, you know, to make a difference in their community or with their family, etc. You know, what are your thoughts on that?
That's a good question. And I think it goes back to a little bit of what Dennis was talking about in terms of we have kind of gotten to this place where we have created silos and experts within these silos. And that's where you have to go in order to get your answers. No one else can know this. And in the process, we have disabled really all of us and the community, and specifically, you know, and basically disabled people based on our caste system, really, on top of it, that then, says you have to go up into, these kinds of fields in order to get your answers or and so forth. And so I think that it's important to learn to speak to basically come to a shared understanding about what it means, what trauma means, what the impact is on all of us. And it's also important to really look at, I think, so much of what you pointed out, Dennis, I think is so important in building the villages, right? And or actually recognizing the villages that are already there, and already functioning, but that we're not recognizing for what they are for whatever reason, because they don't speak the right way or they don't look the right way. And, and so in that process, it's very, continues basically to colonize us in a way that, says this is the kind of way that you have to look at the world in order to have value. And I think this is what we need to tease apart and really take off and understand that, in that concept, for example, relating to trauma-informed care or approaches, when we talk about resilience, what does that really mean? It's not a do-it-yourself approach. It's an intersectional concept that really, brings together all of these areas that you talked about, what Deborah mentioned as well. If you're looking around boards and nonprofit organizations or human services, any organization that is servicing specific groups, and thinking about who are they really representing? What are they what views are they taking into consideration? And so I think that's really kind of the potential that comes along with healing-centered engagement, because it actually if we're following Dr. Ginwright's process, right? So there's 4 pivots, and the first pivot is moving from lens, to mirror. So it really asks all of us to take, off our lenses and say, even if you have, let's say, a trauma-informed or anti-racist lens, right? Take that off and look at yourself, and recognize where your own background. I developed a program, a master community builder program, and we used on purpose a process, a knowledge building process that is based in what is called the Nawi Olin. That's a Mayan way of knowing, right? Of how you come to knowledge. And the first part is you look in the smoking mirrors. So you see yourself in the context. Who am I? In the context of all of that history and what's behind me. And by really coming through that process of asking yourself these questions and reflecting, as Dr. Sean Ginwright says, you arrive at precious new knowledge, and so that's I think and that's where transformation then begins. And then we move into, transformative relations as opposed to the transactional relations.
Yeah, right.
Yeah, and
it's a good,
right.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
For sake of time, I'm going to, stop you there, because I want to have time to also, I've got a really wonderful question for the 3 of you at the end here. And I want to make sure, I'm looking at time, I want to make sure that I have time for it. But before that, I'd also like, to respond to, you don't have to be a trauma specialist, to make a difference. And in response to advancing family and community mental health and making a difference, I want to mention MHANYS CarePath program. This is a program that really makes a difference in family and community health, because it assists individuals and families that are having a hard time managing mental and physical health needs. And they are offered a coach, and they offer direct support. And through the use of SAMHSA's 8 dimensions of wellness, which we mentioned earlier on in this presentation, those social determinants that really also are traumatic for many families are addressed. And MHANYS CarePath is a relational perspective in recovery, And the foundation of the program, it's built on the concept that our health and well-being are never in isolation of one another or our community. So CarePath supports that symbiotic relationship that we talked about earlier between families and community health. And think about it, you know, when families are supported, they have more to give to their communities. And when communities are offered the resources and support they need, they can support their communities. And I feel like CarePath does both. And it's a trauma-informed support tool. And MHANYS has been fortunate to receive some funding that we're going to be able to bring CarePath to families and communities across New York State. So keep a watchful eye on our website for additional information on that coming up. But before we go any further, you know, and hopefully be able to open it up to some questions, I want to ask you, I'm going to read a quote, and I know it's one of Dennis's favorite quotes. It's mine too, but it's a quote from James Baldwin. Not everything that's faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced. And so I'm going to ask each of you to comment and make it please under 2 minutes because we don't have much time. But what does that statement mean to you personally and as a community advocate?
Well, I'll step right up because I've been screaming things to be faced, and it's still not being faced. And you know, I'm also a CarePath coach. I'm concerned. I'm concerned because I work with a lot of families that have been broken apart or without men present in the families, incarcerated or other issues, and it's such a gigantic piece of seeing these broken families and seeing these women who are trying to helm these families by themselves and all the trauma involved in that.
Yeah.
How do we get the CarePath and other programs to make sure those folks are being assisted, because those folks need to be in CarePath, those training in CarePath to give back to other women in the same similar situation. I had a kid who was 17 years old when he went into prison, went to Kentucky. He was in Kentucky, came out at 27. He was a client of mine, substance use. But he was referred to the city mission as his home. Buffed up man, 10 years in prison, 27 years old, and the city mission now is his address on parole. You know, he did last maybe 4 months. His mother is in the Bronx crying for him. And I try to keep her involved to try to keep him out of jail going back. He didn't trust anybody, no one to trust, no one to build that circle with, didn't know where to go.
Yeah.
So it's important to me that, you know, CarePath be embedded with peers or other people who in that community to be able to relate to making it happen. How often have I seen things become something else?
It will be, Dennis.
I don't want this to be something else.
It will be. Well, thank you. Deborah, do you want to respond to that question,
Yeah,
to that quote?
Yeah, that's a hard quote, but it's one I'm very familiar with on many levels. I'll tell just a little bit of my story and how I became my own client and would have loved not to have. After doing the work that I do for a number of years, one of the things that I've done for decades is help people to get Social Security disability. I've done those, never got a turn down on a claim that I filed, whether it was an initial claim or an appeal. But I did that as part of a strategy to help people become independent. At the core of what I do is to help people become economically independent because I see a pathway to freedom and sovereignty for people. And I did not know that I had a bomb going off in my body, that I was living with a disability. And working with just a team of advocates, I always said I want to go undercover in the women's prison, having been an advocate for that population, and in a nursing home. So when I ended up in a nursing home at the age of 33, one of the attorneys I worked with came to visit me and said, "Deborah, you really did it?" I said, "I can't never do it. I didn't have the nerve." But no, I was in a wheelchair. my 14-year-old son was with a friend from church, and here I am as a single parent in a nursing home. I would be in a wheelchair. I would lose everything financially and the use of my body almost totally. And they had to scratch back. And I was not a loving and willing client of any of it, but I had to become my own client. I had to talk people through doing what I did for others. And 2 different nursing homes. And interestingly enough, the house I ended up living in, I helped get the funding for, never thinking I'd need to live there because I couldn't go back to my house. We do have to face hard truths in what we do. But one of my big issues is self-employment. I'm actually a certified self-employment specialist for people with disabilities. I got the certification when they came out with it, but I did that long before. It happens to be that in the capital region, there's no organization that provides the services. I had one of the attorneys I work with called and asked me a question yesterday. I was in throes of joy. Said, "What is this form? I have a client that's telling me about this form. What is it?" And I want organizations throughout New York State, throughout the country that have programs. I want them to be able to see options for the clients that they work with, the students they work with, the families that they work with, to have self-employment. There are not a lot of good options in the work world. Let's stop lying to ourselves. In agencies, is the advocates, is the family members of. There are not a lot of good options for people living with disabilities because workplaces have not done the very best, even some of the most well-meaning workplaces, to make accommodations. They don't understand, especially a lot of mental illnesses, but a lot of physical illnesses. There needs to be a lot of truth-telling in institutions, in industries, and with individuals. But many times we have a 4-legged stool and we're asking the individuals to be all the legs and make all the changes and tell all the truths and be truthful when the organizations and the advocates and the institutions and the industries aren't truthful. And truth has to come, and there has to be truth telling and truth in our behavior on all sides. So I wholeheartedly agree, but we all need to practice that. And
well, his quote says, "Not everything that is faced can be changed, but nothing can be changed until it's faced."
face it. And
you definitely are a living example of that, Deborah. You know, your life is a testimony to that quote. It truly is. And thank you.
I support CarePath in doing that any way that I can. So,
thank you so much, Deborah.
Yeah.
I will take you up on that.
Yes, please do. Yeah, please do.
And okay, now, Yulika, what are your thoughts when you hear that quote? You know, you're a community, advocate, and you're doing this whole community resilience work, so what does that mean for you?
Yeah, I think, both Dennis and Deborah have mentioned great examples. And if I can say my example, as a white woman, what I'm concerned about is that many white people in particular really are shying away from, we have been very successful at creating safe spaces for discussions, but we need to really create brave spaces for discussions so that we can face, this, basically all the debilitating factors in our history and in our current society that continue to contribute to the disparities and the despair that individuals are experiencing.
Yeah.
And so, my appeal would be really specifically to white people to be brave and face, some of these issues and really look at them through a reflective lens. And because to get past the shame and maybe some guilt takes a moment, but that needs to be an internal process. And once we can get past it, then we can experience that kind of transformation. I think that, Deborah's story illustrates so well of what can come in terms. You're not going to change your life situation back to where it was, but you are creating really a movement for others to be able to live with the conditions that are unchangeable. That's.
Well, I knew I wouldn't be disappointed in this conversation today because all three of you are such passionate passionate individuals and community advocates. And I'm just grateful to know you, to know all three of you. I'm just grateful for that. And I just thank you for giving us your time today and your hearts. I just also want to say that one of the big proverbs that I've clung to my whole life is that intelligence that doesn't lead to the heart isn't worth having. So, that's an old African proverb. But now I'm going to, I only have 3 minutes left, so I'm not going to, open it up to questions because, it wouldn't be fair. But I think that if you have any questions for myself or any of the panelists, reach out to me, Deborah at MHANYS, and I can field your questions to the panelist and they'll get back to you. I'm sure that they would not mind doing that. But, your perspectives have been exactly what defines healing-centered engagement, looking at the wholeness of a person's life and becoming an agent in the restoration of your life. And that's what healing-centered engagement is all about. And you're examples of that. Dennis, you're a dear friend, and I've learned so much from you. And I just thank you for that opportunity. And Deborah, you're a new friend that I've learned so much from as well. And Ulrika, we have to work together. It's just meant to be, okay?
Yes.
So thank you. And with that said, I'm going to hand it over to our MHANYS CEO, Glenn Liebman. And stay tuned for our next panel because it's going to be a good one. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Deb and Deborah and Dennis and Ulrika. I love the brave space for discussion. I think it's the whole presentation was just incredibly powerful. So thank you all very much, and look forward to a future with CarePath in it because it's definitely coming.
It's coming.
It is coming. It is coming.
It's exciting.
So it is so exciting, and we're so grateful that you are all so engaged and interested. And I remember, Dennis, when you were taking the training, so it's great. Thank you all so much. So we're going to